The general field of Armenian studies, and specifically those who focus on the Armenian genocide and the period leading up to it, have been rather tardy in taking into account the similar and interrelated experiences of their neighbors and sometime enemies, the Assyrians. This is a generalization, of course, but clearly there's a long way to go, and we have much to learn from each other. Some of the commonalities between Assyrians and Armenians are just part of our common humanity, but others are the result of similar and indeed very closely connected common histories. Like many Armenians, for many Armenians, Assyrians call to mind the writings of William Saroyan. There's the titular character in the long short story, The Assyrian. There is the first story in My Name is Aram, the Summer of the Beautiful White Horse, with the farmer John Biro, an Assyrian who out of loneliness had learned to speak Armenian, whose horse is stolen or borrowed by Aram and his cousin Murad. And of course there is the immortal Theodore Badal in 70,000 Assyrians, one of Saroyan's greatest stories. Theodore Badal, himself 70,000 Assyrians, himself Assyria and man, standing in a barber shop in San Francisco in 1933 and being still himself the whole race. Tonight's lecture is another in a series of talks given in memory of Emmanuel P. Varandyan, novelist, professor of English literature at Ohio State University, longtime NAASR board member, and a benefactor, and a tireless advocate for Armenian studies, and a native of the Urmia region. Professor Varandyan's most famous work, The Well of Ararat, which NAASR republished in 2005 with an introduction by Eden Nabi and a biographical sketch by Professor Richard Fry, is in large part an evocation or recreation of Armenian village life in the Urmia region. If you've never read the book, you should pick up a copy. It is, as they say, famous for a reason, and we have plenty that we'd be happy to sell you. Now, our speaker tonight is Dr. Nicholas Al-Jeloo. We got to know Dr. Al-Jeloo a couple of years ago when he was in the area and spent some time at NAASR. We're really pleased to welcome him back here tonight. He's an Australian Assyrian who received a PhD in Assyrian Syriac Studies from the University of Sydney this year, and he also holds an MA from Leiden University. His photographs have been used in art and history books about the Middle East, including Christopher Baumer's The Church of the East, an illustrated history of Assyrian Christianity. So, without further delay, please welcome Dr. Nicholas Al-Jeloo.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I'd like to say this is more of a turnout than I expected. For me, it's very exciting to be here. My first time at NAASR was about 5 years ago. And since then, I've always wanted to be, part of something here. This is a great institution and you guys are doing great work. I'd like to thank NAASR and everybody else that was involved in making tonight happen. Now, while much information and research has enlightened our understanding of Armenians from Isfahan, especially because of their importance for trade, little other information exists in English about Armenians living in other parts of Iran, even Armenians in Tabriz, a prosperous and important urban community. Like the Assyrians, who were largely based in villages throughout the Middle East, the Armenians of the Urmia region led agrarian lives for much of the 19th century, and even when they moved to the cities, which were hubs of agrarian wholesale markets in wheat and raisins, they often engaged in trade that involved their village roots. Assyrians and Armenians, we can all admit, have had a love-hate relationship throughout much of their history. According to popular legends, the kings Bel and Haik, who founded the Armenian nation, fought each other. Bel was the king of the Assyrians. Then the kings Nasor and Aram, one Assyrian, one Armenian, again fought each other in the story of how lavash was made. Then you have the story of Queen Shamiram and King Ara, and how Queen Shamiram stopped the Armenians speaking their language for 40 years. However, you have it going the other way since the dawn of Christianity. At least 3 of the Catholicoses of Echmiadzin were of Assyrian ancestry, as well as the royal family of the Armenian kingdom of Vaspurakan, the Artsurunis. At the same time as being so different to one another linguistically, and in terms of religious sect, they are also two of the most similar peoples in the Near East in terms of culture and appearance. In his short story, 70,000 Assyrians, which Mark kindly mentioned, William Saroyan stated that Assyrians have noses like our noses, eyes like our eyes, and hearts like our hearts. So just showing you some maps of Iran, and the highlighted area is West Azerbaijan province. So that's a close-up of the province, showing you where Urmia is, right next to the lake and the border with Turkey. Then you have Salamas, which also had a large Armenian population. This sort of gives you an idea of the terrain from the air, which is mostly mountainous, around very flat and very fertile plains. Now, the Urmia region in Iran's West Azerbaijan province is one of the most diverse areas in the country, and in addition to indigenous Assyrian and Armenian communities, it has also been home to Azeris, Kurds, Persians, and Jews. The complete ethnic breakdown of the area's pre-World War I population of 230,000 included at least 78,000 Assyrians and 20,000 Armenians. It is the Assyrians and Armenians who are the focus of my presentation this evening, since they have always shared close ties with one another. As a result of the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, which ended the Russian and Persian wars, a large number of the original Armenians who were living in the Urmia region immigrated to the Russian Empire. I think, if I'm not mistaken, roughly 54,000. And they migrated mostly to the area around what is now Yerevan. So already by the middle of the 1800s, their community in Urmia was already losing its former dominance in the region. A century ago, this area was dotted with Christian villages, populated mostly by ethnic Assyrians and Armenians. Historically, the Armenians formed the majority population in the districts of Salamas, Chahara, and Somaye, which are basically, there's Salamas, there's Chahara, and there's Somaye. And they possessed their own settlements as far as the Shahrchai district in the Urmia plain, from where on the Assyrians predominated. I'm going to explain these districts in a second. Now, the Assyrians, on the other hand, once predominated in the Urmia and Suldus plains and in the mountainous frontier districts from Baradost as far south as Ushnuk. So, as far south as Ushnuk, extending northwards as far as Salamas, where they were originally in the minority. Throughout most of these areas, however, Assyrians and Armenians lived side by side in shared settlements, often praying at one another's churches and burying their dead in the same cemeteries. Since they were both Christian groups, living under Islamic domination, they considered each other co-religionists and cooperated with one another on that front. It is widely believed that Monophysites and Nestorians, quote-unquote, could never get along. Yet in Urmia, the Monophysite Armenians and Nestorian Assyrians had an unspoken rule of intercommunal cooperation and coexistence. Thus we notice that Armenian communities with no priests were served by Assyrian ones, and vice versa. They would pray at each other's churches and attend each other's special occasions, whether festive or mournful. Moreover, Assyrians and Armenians both venerate many of the same saints and held many of the same churches in high regard, and it is not unusual for one church building in a certain village to pass from one community to another on more than one occasion, or for the lines to be blurred as to which church belongs to which community. Often, when the last Assyrians leave a certain village in the Urmia region, they would entrust the keys of their churches and properties to Assyrians that remained. Marriage also, whilst often frowned upon by elders from both communities, has also been quite common since the earliest of times. Additionally, those Assyrians who live close to Armenians or who have mixed ancestry also speak Armenian and vice versa. Some were even literate in one another's languages. For instance, The tomb of an Assyrian youth from Iriawa, which was the village of the late Emmanuel, Varandyan, states the following: Joseph, son of Baba, lived 16 years. He was literate in 3 languages, Persian, Armenian, and Syriac. It was the heavy concentration of Assyrians and Armenians in Persian Azerbaijan, along with their proximity to other major clusters of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, which, in the 19th century, attracted the attention of Western missions, who appealed to the imperial aspirations of their Christian governments for funding and other means of support. Soon, these missionaries, who had come to evangelize the Assyrians and Armenians, found out that the Assyrians, more so than the Armenians, provided them with the fertile ground they needed for proselytization, since their impoverished patriarchate was unable to compete. The missions were also met with fierce opposition from local Armenian priests, and the largest and most influential missions belonged to the American Presbyterians, the French Catholics, and the Russian Orthodox. It is worthy to note that the Chaldean Major Seminary, opened by the French Catholic Mission in the town of Khosrawa at Salamas in 1846, taught a curriculum that included lessons in Armenian, as well as Latin, French, classical Syriac, biblical studies, philosophy, and theology. In the autumn of 1870, the New York-based Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions then expanded its field of operation throughout Iran, which had been previously more popular with the Assyrians, and had also begun to aim at proselytizing the Armenians more actively. By 1892, the number of its mission schools in Iran had risen to 120, enrolling 2,800 mostly Assyrian and Armenian students. These and similar educational institutions were to have a profound effect on both of these communities throughout the region, bringing about a cultural renaissance and an era of prosperity. This was cut short, however, by the fateful events of the First World War, during which the Ottomans invaded the area twice. During the first invasion in 1915, a large number of Assyrians and Armenians in the region suffered atrocities and massacres, most notably in the villages of Ada and Sepurghan and at Ardishay, where a number of young girls drowned themselves in the lake to avoid being raped. At Golphashan, 75 men were exterminated in the Christian cemetery, and in the Armenian town of Haftavan, which the Ottomans used as a military base, they found thousands or maybe hundreds of corpses in the wells. Between 1915 and 1918, hundreds of Armenian volunteers joined an armed force commanded by Assyrian general Agha Petros, which policed and defended the area. Agha Petros was in constant contact with Armenian General Antranik Pasha and did his best to maintain Christian control of the Urmia region, even after having been abandoned by the Russians due to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Eventually, the forces gave up as their ammunition ran out. Those Assyrians and Armenians who managed to survive massacre, hunger, disease, and the general fear and panic that plagued the area as a result of the war abandoned their homes on the 1st of August 1918, fleeing to the Persian town of Hamadan and then to Iraq, amongst a convoy of 90,000 refugees, Assyrian and Armenian. Of the 17,000 Christians who remained in Urmia and its surrounding villages at the time the Ottomans re-invaded in 1918, only 600 managed to survive the massacres, and many of them returned to their homes after the war had ended. In June 1919, Reverend Muller of the American Presbyterian Mission counted 184 Assyrian and Armenian Christians remaining in the Salamas district alone, only 3 of whom were adult males. Most of them had been killed. In 1922, the Persian government allowed groups of Assyrians and Armenians to return from the Bakuba refugee camp in Iraq and resettle their villages. Whilst the number of Armenians had already made their way over to the United States or decided to stay put in Baghdad, many of them patiently waited, along with Assyrian returnees, in cities such as Hamadan, Qazvin, Kermanshah, and Tabriz, until the government deemed it safe for a certain number of them to return. The Persian authorities, however, had put quotas in place, determining just how many Assyrians or Armenians could return to ensure that they would never again be an important element in the area's demography. Since the Armenians that returned did not meet the limit set, and more Assyrians desired to return than the quota allowed, some Assyrians changed their surnames to Armenian ones just to be able to get back to their homes. The Urmia region's Assyrians and Armenians were again caught up in the violence that marked the rise and fall of the Azerbaijan People's Republic. So, just before I move on, just showing you a basic photograph of what the terrain looks around the Urmia plain. You can see the mountains that surround the plain and the plain itself and what the villages over there would have looked like. That is a half Assyrian, half Armenian girl in Urmia. Assyrian and Armenian young children in the village of Iryava, the village of Emmanuel Varandyan, playing basketball in the same courtyard as the Assyrian and Armenian churches, which stand side by side. Another person who's half Armenian, half Assyrian, just showing you the great abundance of fruit in the region. And those were his parents.
Grapes.
Amazingly huge. And those were his parents. Nikolai on the right, who was Armenian, and then the mother, who was Assyrian. And I mentioned how when Armenians would leave a village, they would leave the keys to their churches with the Assyrians. This is the village of Pakabailu, just north of Urmia. And the lady there is the last Christian in the village. She's an Assyrian, and she has the keys to the Armenian church. Now, this is just the skyline of the city of Urmia as it looks today. You can see the steeple of the Assyrian Church of the East, St. Mary's Church, and I'm going to be talking about its courtyard in a second. Now, I was talking about the Azerbaijan People's Republic and its fall in 1946. It was a Soviet puppet state, and basically when it fell and the Persian troops re-entered the area, they killed many of the local Christians. Well, the Christians who got involved, of course, so including Assyrians and Armenians. A 31-year-old Armenian man who died as a result of the situation was buried in the yard of the Old Virgin Mary Assyrian Church at Urmia, and his gravestone, which you can see here, can be still seen there today. So, an Armenian, again, buried in the churchyard of an Assyrian church. In addition, beside another Assyrian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, in the old village of Charbash, there are 8 gravestones belonging to 10 Assyrians and 1 local Armenian. 7 of them were killed around 4 p.m. on December 15, 1946, in a sudden attack on the local Azerbaijan Democratic Party headquarters by Iranian gendarmes and a tank belonging to their security forces. The epitaph of the Armenian, which bears parallel inscriptions in Assyrian and Armenian, reads as follows. Well, I couldn't translate the Armenian, so I've translated the Assyrian. The mighty youth Khosrow, son of Agob Tatavosyan of Chaharbash, lived 23 years. He was cruelly murdered by gendarmes for the sake of freedom, 15th of December 1946. Thus we witness that, during the period, both Assyrian and Armenian men were caught up in a conflict which was not their own, and were brutally murdered by Iranian security forces. Consequently, the Assyrians and Armenians of the Urmia region continued a steady exodus away from their traditional homes to the large urban centers of Iran and afterwards to the diaspora, as they lost all hope in the recreation of their community's strength prior to the First World War. Today, there are currently between 5,000 and 10,000 Assyrians remaining in the Urmia region, along with roughly 500 to 1,000 Armenians, belonging mostly to the Apostolic Church, with some Protestants. About 1,500 Assyrians still reside in about 36 of the remaining Christian villages, whilst another 250 Armenians can be found in another 10 settlements. Alright, I'll leave it on that. Now, the Urmia plain, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the geography. The Urmia plain is crisscrossed by 3 rivers, which flow from the mountains of the Turco-Persian frontier. From north to south, these are the Nazlu Chai, the Shahr Chai, or City River, and the Barandus Chai. Actually, it's probably better if I show a map. So, you've got the Nazlu Chai here, the Shahr Chai here, and the Barandus Chai here. In the Shahr Chai district, at the center of the Urmia plain and surrounding the city, Assyrians and Armenians co-inhabited the villages of Charbash, Digala, Marserges, Akhchakala, Iriava or Rahva, and Qara'agach. They also lived together in the city quarters of Golphashan or Gol, which you can see here, it's now called Hafez. And that's an old Armenian house in that same quarter. That's the yard of the Armenian church, which is right opposite the Assyrian Chaldean Catholic Church. And they also lived in the quarter of Matmaryam. Indeed, in the former, where Armenians predominate, the 16th century church, dedicated to Saint Stephen, is located opposite the cathedral of the Chaldean Catholics, which you can just see. There is also an Armenian private school located nearby on the same block as 2 Assyrian private schools. Now, even in the Matmaryam quarter, which didn't have many Armenian families, you can find an Armenian inscription in the baptistry of the old Assyrian Church of the Virgin Mary, as well as the tombstone which I showed before. Now this is quite significant to reiterate. The cemetery of Charbash was the largest Christian cemetery in the region, and it basically served the village of Charbash, the city of Urmia, and a few other villages around. Roughly 17% of the 439 inscribed tombstones at this cemetery belong to Armenians. So it just shows you that Armenians made up to maybe 20% of the population and were very, very important part of the local fabric. The most significant of the villages of the district where Assyrians and Armenians lived together was that of Iriawa, also known as Reyhanabad or Rahva, which, as we've mentioned already, was the birthplace of Emmanuel Varandyan, in whose honor this lecture is being held today. The 2 oldest churches in the village are located in a spacious courtyard on the eastern edge of the village, and they are still in use. One is shorter and smaller, built of mud brick faced with fired bricks, containing wooden columns and a flat roof of poplar beams. This belongs to the ethnic Assyrians from the Church of the East and is dedicated to St. George. The other church is taller and built of stones, possessing large round columns in its interior and elegant domes. This now belongs to the Armenians, who dedicate it to the Virgin Mary. Asvatsatzin. Whilst the Assyrians dedicate the church to Mart Nargis, or Saint Nargis, the sister of Mergiwergis, or St. George. It appears to be the older one of the 2 churches, since the Iranian Cultural Heritage and Tourism Organization places its construction sometime in the 17th century. Local tradition holds that these 2 churches were formerly stuck to one another, so an Assyrian church and an Armenian church together, with doors in between so you could go from one church to the other. But these were separated when they were rebuilt around 1880. Another tradition credits the Russian Orthodox mission with having separated them when it undertook their restoration in the early 20th century. Indeed, the only dates mentioned in the inscriptions present on the 2 buildings mention that the Armenian church was restored in 1892 and the Assyrian one in 1914. To the north of these churches is the former Christian school, which has now been restored and is utilized as a social hall for the needs of the Assyrian and Armenian communities. Historically, Armenians comprised 45% of the village population, and its landowner was also an Armenian. Now that Christians have become a minority there are still some 15 Armenian families, still 43% of the local Christian population, who live on close terms with their Assyrian neighbors. The Nazluchai district in the north of the Urmia plain was the only part of it which contained purely Armenian villages. Among them, Gardabad, which you see here, and this is the main church in Gardabad. Badilbu. Then you see some inscriptions from the cemetery of Badilbu. And these are some of the villages where Assyrians and Armenians lived together actually. Badilbu was a mixed village. And this is the village of Ikiarach. And this is the Armenian church of Ikiarach. And this is the village of Nakhchivan Tepe, which was also one of the purely Armenian villages. That's inside the church. And the dome of the sanctuary is actually in the Hazarashen formation of the old Armenian houses. These two are the only Armenians left in the village. An old brother and sister. The brothers are deaf mute. So, Armenians also had two other purely Armenian villages, apart from Gardabad, Nakhchivan Tepe and Taklidabad. Due to its central location between the city of Urmia and the provincial airport, Gardabad is still home to the largest Armenian rural population in the region, with about 28 houses. Most Armenians in the Nazluchai area lived in villages which they shared with Assyrians, such as Badilbu, which I've shown, Pakabaylu, Ikiarach, Khan Baba Khan, Qizl Ashaq, Bala, Ada, Spurghan, Yangija, Shirabad, Karajalu, Karaqiz, Zumallan, Rahimawa, Lower Geniza, Karagyoz, and Isalu. The list just kept going. So this is the little chapel that was built on the ruins of the old Armenian church in the village of Shirabad. And this is the Armenian church built, the Assyrian chapel built on top of the ruins of the Armenian church of Surpovanes. Now, a poignant reminder of Assyrian-Armenian cooperation is evident in this village, Ada, which once possessed an Armenian apostolic church dedicated to St. John and called Surpevanus by the Assyrian villagers. It was a 17th century mud brick structure with a wooden roof located to the east of the village. In the 1970s, it fell into ruins, and some years later, a small shrine was built in its place dedicated to Saint Stephen by the Assyrians. Recently, the keys of this chapel were handed over to the representatives of the Armenian Apostolic Church in Tabriz. So, this was reported maybe last month in the Armenian news. Armenians also lived with Assyrians in the villages of Gavilan and Jamalawa, further north in the district of Anzal. In the Baranduzchai, there were no exclusively Armenian settlements, and they all lived in villages which they shared with Assyrians, such as Tacha, Ardishay, Balanush, Sardarud, Babarud, Darbarud, Dizataka, Satluwe, Kukya, and Tumatar. In Sardarud, Darbarud, and Babarud, the communal cemeteries are located in the yards of the small Assyrian churches, and the communities were so closely knit that they even developed their own language based on Turkish and interspersed with Armenian and Assyrian words as a means with which to communicate with one another instead of having two separate languages. So this is in the village of Darbarud. This is the little Assyrian church, and there's the communal cemetery in the yard. So you can see they're mostly Armenian inscriptions if you can look closely. At Balanush, the local church of St. John the Baptist, which you see here in this photograph, is built in its interior as an Assyrian church, but it incorporates inscriptions in Armenian, such as these. You can see this sort of makeshift sort of khachkar with a bit of Armenian writing to the right hand side of it. So even though it's a complete fusion, inside it's not your typical Armenian architecture, and it's typical Assyrian architecture, and then it includes all these Armenian elements. It is actually owned by the Apostolic Church. Whilst on the other hand, the Armenian Church of St. Mary in the village of Dezataka is now cared for by the local Assyrians, and is the location of the communal events hall to the north of it, as well as a small Assyrian chapel dedicated to Rabban Hormizd. Assyrians and Armenians also live together in the Solders district to the south of the Urmia plain in such towns and villages as Mahabad, Daralek, Naqade, Muhammadyar and Qumqala, and in the mountain districts of Somaya and Baradost, in the villages of Huasan and Gangachin. Often they would share the same church building, or it would pass, as mentioned before, from the ownership of one community to another and back again. The largest Armenian presence by far was felt in the districts of Salamas and Chara, where they lived together with Assyrians in villages such as Haftavan, Khosrawa, Koinashar. I'm not going to go through all of these. But there are a lot of Armenian settlements here, probably about 15. The area was ancient. I mean, you can see there are a number of important archaeological sites which attest to the antiquity of human settlement in this district. Among them are large artificial mounds such as this, and on top of it you see the cemetery of the Armenian village of Pakejik. So these probably conceal the ruins of ancient Urartian settlements. And of course there's also a relief depicting the first Sasanian emperor Ardashir I from the 3rd century AD, and his son and successor Shapur the Great receiving the submission of a local Armenian king carved into the cliffs of Khan Takhti. Historically, the Armenians formed the majority population in Salamas, which they knew as Sanamast, and their oldest churches in the district dated between the 11th and 13th centuries AD. Now I say dated because in 1930 a really bad earthquake destroyed most of them, so only one of them is still standing today. As early as the 11th century, the Salamas district was inhabited by both Armenian and Assyrian Christians together, with the latter as the minority ethnic group. After a large number of Armenians immigrated to the Russian Empire, as mentioned before, and their community lost its former dominance, Assyrians began to increase in number and move into their villages. For example, the village of Gulizan in the Salamas area was originally an Armenian village, but was deserted early in the 19th century, and by 1855 had been taken over by the Assyrians, who used its old Armenian church. On the eve of the First World War, however, the two communities were roughly of the same size. Now, the area was an important center for Armenian cultural and literary activity, and the large and important town of Haftavan once possessed a theatre directed by the legendary Armenian playwright Rafi, of which only the facade remains today. So, this is the facade and the dome of the Armenian church or cathedral of Salamas. So just some more photographs. This is the Armenian Church of St. George in Haftavan. This is the only old Armenian church in Salamas which stands today. All the others are in ruins since the 1930 earthquake. Historically, a number of important churches and monasteries in the district have passed hands between both communities. The monastery of St. John the Martyr on the hill above Koinashar, for example, is one of them. During the 16th and 17th centuries, it served as the residence of a number of Assyrian Catholic patriarchates, Assyrian Catholic patriarchs, of the Mar Shimon line, and it was where Mar Shimon Dincha wrote his Catholic profession of faith in 1585. An Armenian mud brick church with a wooden roof was built here in 1825, replacing the old Assyrian church, and it is not known how many times the sacred site passed hands between the two peoples over history. Indeed, it was for a long time considered a local center of pilgrimage and healing, and it was visited by an American missionary in the 1880s, who mentioned that it contained a pit for faith cures. Similarly, the ruins of a small stone church nearby, in the orchards to the south, are also considered sacred to both Assyrians and Armenians. The former know it as Martchanna, or Saint Anna, and claim that it is dedicated to the sister of St. John, whilst to the latter it is Surb Varvar, or Saint Barbara. So that's also one of the churches which has been destroyed by the 1930 earthquake. It's interesting to note that the last Christians to leave Coexistence, where this church is, belonged to a mixed Armenian and Assyrian family, which in 1972 moved to Tehran. The most telling example of intercommunal cooperation, however, is that of the Armenian Apostolic Church of St. Sergius at Khosrawa, built in 1869 for the small local community. During the First World War, it opened its doors to Assyrian refugees after their arrival from Turkey in 1915. Since they were largely Nestorian, they were not allowed to worship in the local Assyrian churches, which belonged to the Catholic fold. It was such that in March 1918, when the Assyrian Patriarch Mar Shimon Benjamin was assassinated by the Kurdish brigand Simko, and his mutilated body retrieved, the funeral was conducted in this church, and he was also buried there with full honours. Unfortunately, the grave is not marked, however. This is because of the hasty way in which the Assyrians were forced to evacuate the area 4 months later, and those that knew where he was buried either did not survive or did not return. Today, the church, complete with its Armenian inscriptions and small graveyard, is symbolically cared for by the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, I'm quite aware of the time, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I should?
You're
yes?
Okay.
I'm okay? Okay.
No one's going anywhere.
Okay. Now, from the data preserved in a corpus of over 2,300 Syriac and Neo-Aramaic inscriptions, which I photographed in situ during 2 fieldwork seasons in 2008 and 2009, we can observe many examples of cooperation and coexistence between Assyrians and Armenians, whether it be in the form of intermarriage, intercommunal business partnerships, etc. Thus, among the names we find in the inscriptions, and these are inscriptions in Assyrian, we find the names of the pilgrim Stepan, son of Jacob, son of Moses, son of Artin, whose wife was named Sarah and whose mother was named Murassa in 1821. It appears that not only was Stepan half Assyrian, but he was also married to one. Another person mentioned, on the other hand, is Gülle, wife of Moses, probably an Armenian, of the Urmia quarter of Gol in 1855. And we also find Abraham, son of Moses and Mary, of Urmia's Mart Mariam neighborhood, who appears to be the product of a mixed marriage. Other Assyrian women married to Armenian men were Shakar, wife of Ostad Sahak of Chaharbaksh, 1903, and Mary, wife of Ohanes, probably from the village of Sangar, 1910. At Saatlu, we find the Saora, or church warden, Baghdasar, who died in 1882, and seems to have been married to an Assyrian woman, since his children, Asenath and Joel, as well as Sarah, from 1884 to 1904, also have their epitaphs written in Assyrian. Also of such mixed heritage appear to be the deacon Oshana, son of Aghasar and Milarzo of the village of Marnucha, 1848, Aziz, son of Asatur, of Dizataka, 1879, and the brothers Baba and Ohanes, sons of Kocharyans of Supurgan, in 1897. It is highly likely that it was more common for Armenian men to marry Assyrian women, since there are a higher number of epitaphs belonging to Armenians but inscribed in Neo-Aramaic or Syriac. These belong to Chacho, son of Aqop of Kizilashuk, 1907, Moses, son of Sannu of Iryava, 1913, Aghasar, son of Baghdasar at Iryava, 1913, Grigor Sahak of Dizataka, 1915, Alexan, son of Chacho Babakhanyan of Digala, 1945, Aghabek, son of Ohanes Sultanian of Saatlu, 1957. So these are all Armenians, but you can see their tombstones are actually inscribed in Assyrian. And we also have Qarapet Sargisyan of Marsargis from 1959. Oh, and you have the village leader or Kucha Kaspar Hartun, also of Saatlu, who died in 1930. On the other hand, we have Haikanush Benjamin of Badilbu from 1990, who appears to have been an Armenian woman married to an Assyrian man. Okay. Many Assyrians are also found to have had Armenian or Armenian-sounding names, among them names such as Panos, Tatos or Tatavos, and Minas. Assyrians with Armenian-sounding surnames, on the other hand, can be found as early as 1918, as in the case of Allahverdi Perayan, who was buried at Charbash, and Jean Kazanchian, who left graffiti in Assyrian on a wooden column at the Church of St. George in the village of Qurtapa in 1935, and Nviya Shahbazyan, son of Jonah of Badilbu, who died in 1939. Furthermore, it should be noted that the relations between the Armenians and the largely Catholic Assyrians, or the Chaldeans, in Urmia's Golphashan Ali Khan quarter were so close that we discover at least one Armenian who had converted to Catholicism, who also studied at the College of the Propaganda in Rome and later died and was buried in the Assyrian cemetery at Charbash. His epitaph, which is written in Assyrian only, reads, Aristakis Vartabed, Catholic priest, student of the Propaganda, son of Terhartun, departed from the world on the 5th of December 1900. Catholicism never took hold amongst Urmia's Armenians, however, and most of them remained Orthodox. Bilingual funerary inscriptions in Syriac or Assyrian and Armenian were also common in the area. Indeed, Armenian appears beside Assyrian in inscriptions dating from 1865 and 1962, both in the plains of Urmia and Salamas. The earliest example of this comes from the village of Khosrawa in Salamas and belongs to a child named Sliva, probably the result of a mixed marriage. This is undated, but judging from the context and the design of the tomb, it was probably carved in the mid-15th century, so the 1400s. A damaged bilingual inscription belonging to Ostad Aziz, 1900, was also once kept in the yard of the Chaldean Catholic Cathedral in Urmia. The parallel funerary inscriptions of one man from Dizataka, of mixed Assyrian and Armenian heritage, who died in 1943, is quite elaborate and boasts of him. Now let me see if I can find it. There it is. It boasts of him having purchased his own headstone while he was alive. It reads, Hartun, in brackets, Minas, son of Sayyad Asatur of Dizataka, born in 1870. Spent 35 years of my life in foreign lands, most of them in Tbilisi, so in Georgia. In my healthy days, I bought my stone on 16th of April 1932. I came into the world oppressively, I lived in it amazingly, and I exited out of it, and I exited it out of necessity. This further provides us with an idea of wealth and social status belonging to the people of that area. More recently, the gravestone of Mary, wife of Agha of Sulduz, at the village of Tekka, who died in 1962, bears parallel inscriptions in Assyrian and Armenian, probably indicating either her mixed ancestry or that she was married to an Armenian. To find such bilingual inscriptions is thus not surprising. Not only do many of these inscriptions commemorate people of mixed Armenian and Assyrian heritage, but they also include gravestones carved by Assyrian artists for Armenian clients and vice versa. This testifies to the close relationship of coexistence which has historically linked these two peoples. So, furthermore, Assyrians and Armenians employed each other for jobs that they needed done. They trusted each other. They built churches for one another and carved tombstones for one another. A dedicatory inscription from Qoynashar in Salamas was probably carved by the Ostad Avda, who renovated the Assyrian church of Saint Kyriakos there in the 17th century, but who also built the local Armenian church. Indeed, it appears as if he was so skillful and popular that he was commissioned by the Armenian community there to build their own church. This is also indicative of the close relations enjoyed between the Assyrians and Armenians roughly 4 centuries ago, and which still continue to this day. Especially noteworthy is the fact that at least 4 Armenians from the late Emmanuel Varandyan's village had their gravestones carved by Assyrian artisans. Among these artisans, I'm not going to mention their names. If you want their names, you can come and get them from me later. Now, we also have the artisan Baba, son of Ostad Isaac of Charbash, who carved the gravestone belonging to the Armenian that died in the massacre that we mentioned before in 1945. And then we have the tombstones of Yohannes Saghian, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, who died at Golphashan in 1948, which bears his name in Armenian, but it has a biblical quotation in Assyrian, indicating that it was carved by an Assyrian as well. This continues even today, as we see in the gravestone of another Armenian at the same village, Golphashan, from 1999, which also bears the name in Armenian and the biblical quotation in Assyrian. It probably has something to do with the schools in the area. Maybe a lot of Armenians went to Assyrian schools and learned how to read and write in Assyrian. Alright, now I'm going to go back to this. Armenians, on the other hand, also carved gravestones for Assyrians, and it is interesting that at least 3 signed their names in the Syriac script. So we have Baron Tateos Sarkis, for instance, who carved a grave for an Assyrian of the village of Sepurgan in 1885. Ostad Khacho of Nakhchivan Tepe, who carved a grave for an Assyrian of the same village in 1887. Ostad Sayyad, who is this person who carved this stone right here. You can see that the top 2 registers are in Assyrian and the bottom one is in Armenian. This was in the village of Yangija. And Ostad Orhan, of unknown origin, and probably of Armenian or part Armenian heritage, who engraved at least 3 gravestones between 1900 and 1937. There is no evidence in the inscriptions that I looked for, however, of any local Muslims, Kurds, Persians, or Azeris producing gravestones for the Assyrians and Armenians, and vice versa. Assyrians and Armenians counted on each other, and they also shared customs such as carving inscriptions onto the columns that supported the roofs of structures such as churches. This is one 19th century example that can be found in the Armenian village, or mostly Armenian village of Qaraqiz, and it is also repeated in the Assyrian village of Ada from around the same time. Graffiti was also a popular method of expression used by both Assyrians and Armenians, and reveals to us other aspects that bound the two communities together. As more and more people learned to read and write, this became an outlet for them to leave their mark on important structures, especially churches, for posterity. Examples of such inscriptions may thus be found at important sites of local pilgrimage, both Assyrian and Armenian, further indicating close and amicable relations between the two neighbouring ethnicities during the 19th and 20th centuries. Examples can thus be found written by Armenian visitors to the Assyrian churches of St. Sergius and Bacchus at Marsergis and St. Hormuz at Dazgire, which are both local sites of pilgrimage. At the important church of St. Avdishar in the village of Tarmane, we also find graffiti belonging to one Sanvel Shahbazyan from 1947. Indeed, these are the only Armenian inscriptions found on Assyrian churches, and they are quite personalized. They are generally just carved by visitors and pilgrims of Armenian ethnicity. Of a similar standing is the ancient Armenian stone church of St. Peter, Sur Petros, at the village of Qarabagh in the district of Anzal. The plaster of its interior is covered in graffiti in Armenian and Persian, as well as two examples in Assyrian. Whilst one bears the name of a visitor scratched onto the bare stone with a pebble, the other is written with pencil on the plaster and carries the date 24th of April 1926, the feast day of St. George, which would have been a day of pilgrimage for Christians all over the region to this ancient and venerable edifice. Another, more famous Armenian religious site, which is also a more frequent place of pilgrimage, is the monastery of St. Thaddeus at Qarakhelisa near Maku. Recent Assyrian visitors have noticed old graffiti in Syriac there. I haven't been able to verify this. In short, such graffiti are particularly significant in tangibly demonstrating the importance of pilgrimage sites to local Assyrians and Armenians and the close relationships which they shared in regards to the places which both peoples held to be sacred. So, this is an example of the stonework from the church of St. Sergius and Bacchus at Marsergis. It's a 6th century church, and here you can see Armenian very clearly. I mean, you can't really read it. I can't read it, but it's been scratched into the stones of the wall. And here you've got one in Assyrian actually. So this is in Assyrian, and that's in Armenian, by different visitors. As has been demonstrated, Assyrians and Armenians in the Urmia region, while speaking different languages, often functioned as one community due to their common Christian religion. They shared not only a strong spirit of solidarity with one another, but also deep marital and kinship ties. This is apparent in the way they coexisted with one another in the area's towns and villages, spoke each other's languages, attended one another's schools, churches, intermarried, and buried their dead in one another's cemeteries. It is truly an example that both communities can be proud of, and it is one repeated in other areas such as Urfa, Kharpert, Diyarbakir, Qamishli, and Baghdad. It shows how Assyrians and Armenians, throughout their whole many years of having a love-hate relationship, many centuries, can both cooperate with one another on many levels, having been neighbours since the dawn of time and since the ancient Assyrian and Urartian kingdoms. Let us hope such strong bonds continue into the future as we both seek recognition for our genocides, as well as justice and security for those of our peoples that still remain in the volatile Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For Q&A,
I'm going to try to use this. So, I will come to you. If there are any questions.
May I ask what prompted you to take on this very complicated subject? I mean, was there one particular incident, one relative, or just doing something that no one else had done?
This presentation sprung as a result of my PhD thesis, or my doctoral dissertation. My doctoral dissertation was basically to write a socio-cultural history and write about the heritage of the Assyrians in the Urmia region. And to do that, I decided, I was a bit crazy, I was younger at the time, it was 5 years ago, I decided to go to Iran twice and conduct 2-month or 3-month fieldwork seasons, where I would basically survey as much as I can of the roughly 250 Assyrian and Armenian villages in the area. So I did what I could. I looked for basically churches, cemeteries, anything with any inscription on them. I've got to admit, I'm sort of biased. I mean, my study was about the Assyrians, but obviously when writing about the Assyrians in Urmia, you cannot not write about the Armenians. But I didn't collect everything that there is about the Armenians there. There are huge cemeteries in some of the Armenian villages with just thousands upon thousands of tombstones with inscriptions on them going back hundreds of years, especially the cemetery of Haftavan.
This is unbelievable. On the other note, I'd like to really know how many people we have in Iran now, Assyrian or Armenian, and does the Iranian government preserve or protect or help us to really preserve our archives there?
In Iran, I mean, I mentioned there are roughly 500 to 1,000 Armenians left in the Urmia region, and about maybe 5 to 10,000 Assyrians left in that Urmia region as well. In the whole of Iran, I would say there's about 15 to 20,000 Assyrians left. And the estimates vary for the Armenians because you have big communities like Tabriz and Isfahan and Shiraz and Tehran, etc. So the estimates go from between 150,000 to 300,000 Armenians. The Assyrians and Armenians have both been recognized as ethno-religious minorities in the 1908 constitution of Iran. So the Armenians have 2 representatives in Iranian Majlis or parliament, one for the northern part of the country, so Tabriz, and one for the southern part of the country, so Isfahan and Tehran. And the Assyrians also have 1 member of parliament. Recently, the Iranian government promoted 3 Armenian churches and monasteries, I think 3 or 4, in West Azerbaijan province to the status of World Heritage Site with UNESCO. So not only is the Iranian government protecting Assyrian and Armenian churches by placing them on their national heritage list and spending Iranian money, government money, to restore and keep these churches standing, but they're also trying to put a lot of them on the World Heritage List and get the world knowing about the Christian, Assyrian or Armenian heritage in Iran.
Could you explain the difference between the terminology of Assyrian and Syrian?
It depends on the context, it depends on who you're trying to describe, it depends on the geography, it depends on the time period. Basically. Syrian can mean Assyrians, it can mean Arabs from the Republic of Syria, it can mean the ancient Assyrians, it can mean Syriac, it can mean a whole plethora of different things. If you want to return to the origin of the word Syria, the word Syria is basically a shortened form of Assyria. And the way that we can gauge this is basically from Armenian. Now, in Armenian, the Assyrians, or the ancient Assyrians who ruled the empire that we know of, so Shamiram, etc., they're called, I think, Asurestansi. So, Assyrians in general are called Asuri or Asuretsi. So, the difference between Asuri and Asuretsi is basically the difference between a higher stansi and a high, right? So someone that's a citizen of a state and someone that is an ethnic person living outside of his native state. Many people try and define the term Asuri as Syrian rather than Assyrian, but I think that theory has been debunked. But the Armenians actually are, since they have been the closest neighbors and the longest neighbors to the Assyrians, can probably bear the most effective witness as to the Assyrians, the modern Assyrians, and their ancient Assyrian ancestry.
Just one technical question. What is actually the difference between Syriac and Aramaic?
Well, Aramaic is a larger language, and Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic that began around the city of Edessa, or Urfa, in the 1st century AD, 1st century BC, roughly. Syriac, with the dawn of Christianity and the rise of Christianity through the city of Edessa, Syriac became, you could say, the official liturgical and administrative language of the Aramaic-speaking Christian churches. So, let me describe it this way. Aramaic is more like a language family, as opposed to Syriac, which is a literary version of the language, but doesn't encompass the whole gamut of dialects belonging to it. So, for example, just as you have Lebanese Arabic and Egyptian Arabic and Iraqi Arabic and Moroccan Arabic, there was also Levantine Aramaic, Babylonian Aramaic, and Assyrian Aramaic. And these were vernacular dialects that were not really written down until, at least in the scope of Assyrian Aramaic, or what is called Northeastern Neo-Aramaic. These weren't written down until the 1600s. So, a lot of the inscriptions that I showed, some are in Syriac, which is that ancient literary language similar to Krapar, which is used by the church, and some are in Assyrian or Neo-Aramaic, which is basically the spoken language used by the people.
In Urmia, during the genocide, was it affected? And if so, was Urmia pre-World War I under Persian rule or Ottoman Empire rule? And if it wasn't, then why did Assyrians decide to go down to Iraq and instead of maybe going into Urmia?
Urmia has always been under Persian rule. There were some border disputes in the early 20th century, and they were mostly centered around the Urmia region. The Assyrians and the Armenians in the Urmia region did suffer as a result of the genocide because the Turkish army invaded. And the Turkish army invaded basically in frustration after being defeated at the Battle of Sarikamish. So they basically stormed back, and one section of them, which later became known as the Qasab Tabore, or the Butchers Battalion, went and murdered all the Christians in Bitlis and in Sirt. And then the other half basically went to Iran and invaded. And they held Urmia and Salamas for roughly 3 or 4 months, until the Russians managed to bring back the forces and take it off them again. But in that period, as I said, for example, in the village of Haftuvan, if you read the newspaper reports, they talk about hundreds of headless Armenian corpses buried in the wells of the village. And, you know, stories of those 75 young girls who ran into the lake and drowned themselves so that they wouldn't get raped by the Turks who came and invaded. That was just the first time that the Turks invaded, that the Ottomans invaded. The second time they invaded was in 1918, since the Assyrians and the Armenians in the area were basically sitting ducks. They'd run out of ammunition. The Russian Revolution had happened in 1917, so they were no longer helping. They'd abandoned these people, and these people were trying to maintain themselves in the Urmia and Salamas plains against the Kurds, against the Turks, and against whoever else wanted to come in and massacre them or attack them. They had to flee. Whoever stayed was basically massacred by the Turks that invaded. So out of 17,000 people that remained, Christian people that remained, only 600 survived.
Just a technical question again. You mentioned Chaldean. Is that also Assyrian, synonymous, or different?
Now, when people ask me that, especially Armenians, I try and look for an Armenian that knows these things, because I've been told by some Armenians that they call Chaldeans Asuri, they call Assyrians Asuri, and they call Syriac or Syriani, they call them Asuri as well. So they're all really the same. Chaldeans are just Catholics. They're people from the Assyrian Church of the East, so the Eastern Assyrian Church, as opposed to the Western Assyrian Church. So from the Eastern Assyrian Church that followed the Pope, basically. And since the 1500s, their church has been called the Chaldean Catholic Church.
Well, is there an East Assyrian and a Western Assyrian church?
There is. The Eastern Assyrian Church is the Assyrian Church of the East. The Western Assyrian Church is the Assyrian Orthodox Church of Antioch, or the Syriani, the Syrian or Syriac Orthodox.
Okay, and I was going to ask, what's the difference between those religions and, let's say, Armenian Apostolic?
Well, the Syrian Orthodox Church, which is the Western Assyrian Church, it's actually in communion with the Armenian Apostolic Church. Since they're both Miaphysite or Monophysite churches, they have the same Christology. And the difference between the West Assyrian Church and the East Assyrian Church is namely the Christology, since the East Assyrian Church is Diophysite, which used to be known as Nestorian, and they have two separate dialects, two separate scripts descended from the same script. They have two separate patriarchates and two separate structures of leadership. And basically, since the Western Assyrian Church was within the confines of the Byzantine or Roman Empire, they have more influence from that sort of Greek or Roman side, whilst the Church of the East was located mostly within the confines of the Persian Empire and has more influence from the Persians. That's the best explanation I can give.
Seriously, you're just trying to make Armenians feel better, but thank you. We appreciate it.
Just as an addenda, obviously you didn't go to Armenia.
I'm dying to go.
Because there's a large Assyrian community in Armenia.
Oh yeah.
And also there's a monument in Armenia dedicated to the Assyrians who died in the Holocaust.
It's on Abovyan Street.
It's on Nalbandian.
Nalbandian Street.
Nalbandian, Moscovian, and Kanjan.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It's by that little park.
That's
I've seen
right.
a photograph, but I'm dying to go.
And there's
I've got
also an
friends over
Assyrian
there.
flag flying over it. That was interesting. I didn't know they had a flag.
That's not. Yeah, we do have a flag.
Huh?
We do have a flag.
Well, that flag is flying over it day and night.
Well, thank you to the Armenian government for letting us have a monument there and fly our flag.
Oh, the Assyrians are citizens of Armenia.
Perfect.
Please stick around for refreshments and to chat. So thank you so much for being here tonight, Armenians, Assyrians, and others.